somewhere in France. 1918, 4 miles behind enemy lines. The men of the Sherwood Foresters crouch in a shallow trench, surrounded. German artillery has torn apart every telephone wire. Every runner sent to headquarters has been cut down by machine gun fire. The battalion is pinned, bleeding, and running out of time. Their commanding officer reaches for a leather pouch and straps it to the collar of an Airedale Terrier named Jack. Inside the pouch, a single piece of paper, their last hope. A pat on the head, a quiet word, then simply, go. The dog slips over the parapet and vanishes into the smoke. What happens next will save an entire battalion, and it will change what the British Army believes about the bond between soldier and dog. This is the true story of Britain's war dogs, the 4-legged soldiers who parachuted into Normandy, who dug survivors from the rubble of the Blitz, and who gave their lives running through shell fire to deliver messages that would determine whether hundreds of men lived or died. It is a story of courage that defied training, of loyalty that transcended species, and of soldiers who would later say, with complete sincerity, that a dog had saved their lives. To understand how dogs came to serve in the British Army, we must begin with one man's obsession. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Haughtonville Richardson had spent decades studying the potential of dogs in warfare. A former officer in the Sherwood Foresters himself, Richardson had watched with frustration as the British military dismissed his proposals while the Germans trained thousands of dogs for frontline service. When war erupted in 1914, Richardson was ready, but the War Office was not. It took 2 years of relentless advocacy and the mounting desperation of trench warfare before the Army finally listened. In late 1916, Richardson successfully trained 2 Airedale Terriers named Wolf and Prince to carry messages across 2 miles of terrain without a single failure. On New Year's Eve, the 2 dogs departed for France. What they accomplished changed everything. The dogs proved so reliable, so fearless, that officers began requesting more. In 1917, the War Office officially established the British War Dog School at Shoeburyness in Essex, with Richardson as commandant and his wife Blanche serving alongside him. The appeal went out across Britain: send your dogs to war. The response was extraordinary. Within weeks, thousands of pet owners offered their beloved companions to the war effort. Letters arrived at the school that broke Richardson's heart. One woman wrote simply, "I've given my husband and my sons. Now that he too is required, I give my dog." Over 2,000 dogs would pass through Richardson's school: Airedales, Collies, Lurchers, even mongrels with the right temperament. Each underwent 6 weeks of intensive training, leaping over obstacle courses, crawling through barbed wire, learning to ignore the thunder of artillery that would send most animals into panic. The lives saved were estimated in the thousands. Which brings us back to Jack, the Airedale racing through German shell fire in 1918. The Sherwood Foresters had been cut off at an advanced post. German forces had blown massive craters behind their position, strung the approaches with barbed wire, and severed every line of communication. Unless headquarters could be informed that reinforcements were needed immediately, the entire battalion faced annihilation. No man could make it through. But Jack was different. The Airedale kept low to the ground. His black and tan coat streaked with mud as shells erupted around him. A piece of shrapnel smashed into his jaw, shattering the bone. He kept running. Another shell tore open his coat down the length of his back. He kept running. Then his front paw was hit, shattered by fragments. He could no longer run, so he crawled. For the final 3 kilometers, Jack dragged his broken body across the churned earth, through the wire, past the craters, until he reached headquarters. A former lieutenant colonel in the Territorial Army who owned several Airedales later described what happened next. There was the glaze of death in his eyes when he reached headquarters, but he'd done his work. He'd saved his battalion. Jack delivered the message and collapsed at the feet of the receiving officer. He died moments later. Reinforcements were dispatched immediately. The Sherwood Foresters were saved. Had the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, existed during the First World War, Jack would surely have earned one. Instead, his story passed into legend, told and retold by the soldiers whose lives he had purchased with his own. The lessons of the Great War were not forgotten. When Britain faced Hitler's Germany in 1939, the War Office once again turned to its four-legged soldiers. A new training school opened at Potter's Bar in Hertfordshire, and once again, the British public responded. In May 1941, an appeal appeared in British newspapers requesting dogs for military service. Within 2 weeks, 7,000 dogs had been offered. Some owners could no longer feed their pets due to rationing. Others simply wanted to contribute to the war effort. Many slipped off their dogs' collars and brought them to collection points on pieces of string, pretending they were strays to spare themselves the pain of goodbye. Witnesses described women breaking down in tears as their pets tried to follow them out of the receiving stations. These dogs would serve in ways their owners could never have imagined. September 7th, 1940. Black Saturday. The German Luftwaffe unleashed its blitzkrieg on London. For 56 of the next 57 nights, the city would burn. 40,000 civilians died. More than 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged, and beneath the rubble of shattered buildings, survivors waited in darkness, praying someone would find them. In the chaos of those early raids, a stray terrier wandered through the wreckage of Poplar in East London. An air raid warden named Mr. E. King found the dog hungry, alone, frightened, and began feeding him scraps. He named the dog Rip. No one trained Rip for search and rescue work. No one taught him to locate bodies beneath collapsed buildings. But something in the little terrier understood what was needed. One evening, Rip began pawing frantically at a pile of rubble, far from where the rescue crews were digging. King watched the dog's determination, his increasingly desperate scratching, and made a decision. He called over his team. They found a survivor. Over the next 12 months, Rip located more than 100 victims of the air raids. His success prompted the authorities to formally train search and rescue dogs, a program that continues to this day. How welcome to the victims must have been the first sounds of those scrabbling paws, one account recorded. The shrill terrier yaps, and the first sight of the grinning face with its merry, friendly eyes. Rip received the Dickin Medal in 1945. He wore it on his collar until the day he died. His headstone reads, "We also serve, for the dog whose body lies here played his part in the Battle of Britain." Another Blitz hero emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. A German shepherd named Jet, originally trained as an anti-sabotage dog to sniff for bombs, was pressed into search and rescue work when Hitler's new V1 and V2 revenge weapons began devastating London in 1944. Over the course of the war, Jet located 125 individuals beneath the ruins. Half of them were pulled from the ground alive. The dog worked around the clock, braving fire and chaos that would send most animals fleeing in terror. On numerous occasions, Jet found victims when the human searchers were convinced there was no one left to save. During one rescue, the crews thought they had recovered everyone from a collapsed hotel, but Jet barked relentlessly, refusing to leave. insisting there was someone still trapped. The men dug where he indicated. A woman was pulled from the wreckage alive. Without Jet, she would have been left for dead. But perhaps the most remarkable chapter in the story of Britain's war dogs was written in the skies over Normandy on the night before D-Day, June 5th, 1944. 11:30 p.m., 3 aircraft carrying the elite sniper reconnaissance platoon of the 13th Parachute Battalion lifted off from England. Each plane held 20 men and 1 dog. These were the Paradogs, German shepherds trained to parachute into enemy territory alongside British paratroopers. Their mission: to sniff out hidden enemies, locate minefields, and stand guard while their handlers slept. The training had been extraordinary. At Lark Hill Garrison, the dogs sat for hours aboard transport planes with engines running, learning to tolerate the deafening noise and vibration. They were taught to identify the smell of explosives and gunpowder. They practiced scenarios that simulated combat, how to track enemy soldiers, how to stay low during firefights, what to do if their handlers were captured. Then came the parachutes. The dogs were fitted with harnesses originally designed to drop bicycles, modified so their stronger rear legs would absorb the shock of landing. Handlers withheld food and water before jumps, then enticed the dogs out of the aircraft with 2-pound pieces of meat. Lance Corporal Ken Bailey recalled a training jump with a dog named Rani. After my chute developed, I turned to face the line of flight. The dog was 30 yards away and slightly above. The chute had opened and was oscillating slightly. She looked somewhat bewildered but showed no sign of fear. I called out, and she immediately turned in my direction and wagged her tail vigorously. At 1:10 a.m. on June 6th, over Normandy, the Paradogs faced their first combat jump. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Tracers streaked past the open doors of the aircraft. The noise was beyond anything the training had prepared them for. An Alsatian collie cross named Bing, called Brian in civilian life, was supposed to jump after his handler. But when Bailey leaped from the plane, Bing retreated inside, confused and terrified by the chaos. The jump master had to unplug his radio equipment, cradle Bing in his arms, and throw him out of the aircraft. The dog's parachute caught in a tree. He hung there for 2 hours, drawing enemy fire, until paratroopers arrived at dawn to cut him down. 2 lacerations on his face were bleeding, likely from German shell fragments. He was back fighting within 2 days. Major Ellis Dean, a D-Day veteran and battalion historian, later wrote that Bing was the only one of them who could cope with the incessant mortaring and shelling to which we were subjected. The soldiers learned to watch him carefully. One veteran recalled, "We would keep an eye on the dog as he was the first to hear enemy shells and mortars being fired. Bing would freeze like a pointer when he sensed hidden enemies, alerting his unit to German snipers in the hedgerows of Normandy before they could spring an ambush." He survived the war. He jumped again during Operation Varsity in March 1945. One of 16,000 paratroopers in the largest single-day airborne operation in history. He earned the Dickin Medal in 1947. When Bing returned to his civilian owner, Betty Fetch was waiting on the platform. She noted that he looked a little unsure of himself. She said, "Hello, you old softy." The Alsatian rolled over for a belly rub. He was home. Well, not all the Paradogs were so fortunate. Private Emile Corteil was 19 years old, a dog handler with the 9th Parachute Battalion. His German shepherd, Glenn, was more than a military asset. The dog was, in the words of one soldier who served alongside them, more or less one of us. On exercises before D-Day, Glenn was inseparable from his handler. He had his own parachute and harness, with a little red light attached. One soldier remembered. He jumped on his own, and often seemed more eager to do so than us. In the early hours of June 6th, Corteil and Glenn parachuted into the Orne River Valley. Their objective, the heavily defended Ranville Battery. Like so many that night, they landed far from their drop zone. They joined a scattered group of paratroopers under Brigadier James Hill, making their way through flooded fields and German patrols toward their objective. Then came the sound of aircraft engines, Allied Typhoons, tasked with strafing any movement in certain sectors to protect the invasion, had orders to fire on the very area where the lost paratroopers were struggling to regroup. The pilots saw movement below. They attacked. When the guns fell silent, Private Corteil and Glenn lay dead together. A recovery party found them later, roughly buried in a bomb crater by other survivors. At the request of Major Alan Parry, the 19-year-old soldier and his dog were buried together in Ranville War Cemetery. It is believed to be the only wartime grave burial of a dog handler and his dog in any Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery. Corteil's mother chose the inscription for his headstone. It reads, "Had you known our boy, you would have loved him too. Glenn, his paratroop dog, was killed with him." A soldier who served with them left this testimony. Private Corteil and Glenn used to be together on pre-D-Day exercises, and all knew the dog, who was in superb condition and was more or less one of us. Unfortunately, they were killed together, but I am sure that if it had to be death, then no one would have wanted it to be different. The bond between handler and dog transcended training, transcended duty, transcended even death. These were not simply animals deployed as military assets. They were companions who shared foxholes and rations, who provided warmth on freezing nights and comfort in moments of terror. Soldiers who had been trained to suppress all emotion found themselves confiding in dogs who would never repeat their secrets, never judge their fears. I'd find some of the soldiers on the cot beds with him, just chatting away, recalled one handler about his bomb detection dog decades later. They felt they could confide in him, and it wouldn't be going anywhere else. So what did British soldiers say when a single dog saved a platoon? They said he'd done his work, he'd saved his battalion. They said, the only one who could cope with the incessant mortaring and shelling. They said, had you known our boy, you would have loved him too. They said nothing at all, just reached down to scratch behind a muddy ear, or offered half a tin of rations to a wet nose pressed against their hand. The Dickin Medal has now been awarded more than 70 times to pigeons, horses, one cat, and dozens of dogs. Each citation tells a story of conspicuous gallantry, of devotion to duty, of lives saved through courage that knew no species boundary. But the truest measure of what these dogs meant lies not in medals or monuments. It lies in the words of Betty Fetch, waiting on a railway platform in 1946, as a scarred Alsatian who had parachuted into Normandy and survived the shelling of the Bocage came home at last. "Hello, you old softy." And the dog, who had seen things no creature should ever see, rolled over and asked for a belly rub. So today, in the quiet of Ranville Cemetery, visitors still stop at a headstone near the Cross of Sacrifice. They read the inscription, and they understand. A 19-year-old boy and his dog, sleeping side by side in a peaceful corner of Normandy they helped to liberate. Together in life, together in death, together forever.